I still remember the summer of 2012 when my brother and I decided to camp out in the woods near a small lake in northern Michigan. I was 20 at the time and my brother Ryan was 18. We had camped before, but never this deep in the woods and never this far from any real road. The trail we used wasn't even an official camping trail, just a thin path that fishermen sometimes used to reach the lake. We carried enough supplies to stay 2 nights. Small tent, food, water, fishing rods, and a couple knives. Nothing fancy. We were young, a little careless, and excited to be away from people. The plan was simple. Set up by the lake, fish during the day, cook over a fire, and just enjoy the quiet. The hike took almost 2 hours, and we barely saw anyone after leaving the parking area. The deeper we went, the more the sounds of traffic and people faded away until all we could hear were birds, branches cracking under our boots, and the occasional chipmunk darting across the path. When we finally reached the lake, it felt almost untouched. The water was still, reflecting the trees and sky, and the shore was soft with moss and damp leaves. We set the tent back from the water under some tall pines, where the ground was flat enough for sleeping. The first day went as planned. We fished, built a small fire, and cooked what little we caught. I remember the sun setting across the water, the sky turning orange and purple, and the air getting cooler with the smell of smoke drifting from the fire. That night, the woods were so quiet it was almost uncomfortable. I wasn't used to hearing nothing but insects and the occasional splash from the lake. No cars, no voices, nothing. Just us. The second day, we hiked around the lake and explored further back into the woods. We didn't see a single person. By evening, clouds started moving in, darker and heavier than the night before. It looked like rain might come, so we gathered extra wood and ate early. By the time the sun disappeared, the air felt heavier, and a light wind was pushing through the trees. We crawled into the tent, laid out our sleeping bags, and listened to the forest around us. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was strange because I'm usually a heavy sleeper. At first, I thought it was the wind that woke me, but then I realized the forest was completely silent. Not just quiet, silent. No crickets, no frogs, no rustling leaves, just still air. I lay there on my back staring at the nylon roof of the tent, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps on leaves. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They were close, no more than 30 or 40 feet away. I didn't move at first. My brother was still asleep beside me, breathing steadily. I told myself it could be a deer or maybe a raccoon nosing around, but something felt off. The steps weren't scattered or quick like an animal's. They were slow, steady, almost careful. Whoever it was, they were trying not to make noise but weren't doing a great job of it. The sound moved around, circling near our tent. I could hear twigs snapping and the weight of each step pressing into the ground. I froze, barely breathing, afraid even the smallest sound would draw attention. The fire had burned out hours ago, so outside was pitch dark. There was no moonlight breaking through the clouds, no way to see out. The tent felt paper thin, and I couldn't shake the thought that whoever was out there could be just a few feet away, staring at our camp. The footsteps went on for what felt like forever. At times they faded, then came closer again. My stomach was tight, my hands clammy inside the sleeping bag. I thought about waking Ryan, but I didn't want to move. I just listened, heart pounding, trying to stay as quiet as possible. After a while, the sound slowly drifted away, deeper into the woods. The silence that followed was just as heavy, but I forced myself to stay still until exhaustion finally pulled me back to sleep. When the sun rose, I pretended nothing happened. I didn't mention it to Ryan. I convinced myself it was probably just a deer or maybe my imagination. But when I stepped outside the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. On the damp ground, just a few feet from where we had set up, were shoe prints. Not boots like ours, not hiking prints, but flat-soled shoes almost like worn sneakers. They weren't fresh enough to show sharp detail, but clear enough to see they didn't belong to us. Someone had been walking around our tent in the night. I finally told Ryan, and he laughed it off at first, but when he saw the prints, his face changed. He went quiet and suggested we cut the trip short. Still, we didn't want to pack up right away. We convinced ourselves it might have been some fisherman or hiker passing through late, though neither of us really believed it. We stayed for the rest of the day, fishing again, trying to enjoy it, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing over my shoulder, checking the tree line, listening for anything unusual. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring into the dark, listening to Ryan's breathing beside me. Hours passed with only the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of wind. But then, sometime after midnight, I caught it again. The sound of branches breaking under weight. Slow steps, heavier this time, closer than before. My chest tightened, and I felt sweat forming on my forehead. This wasn't my imagination. Whoever it was had come back. I could hear them moving just outside, circling us again. At one point, I swear I heard breathing low and steady, just a few feet from the tent. My brother stirred but didn't wake, and I stayed frozen, barely even blinking. The steps moved around the camp for what must have been half an hour. Then silence. I stayed awake until morning, terrified they were still out there waiting. When daylight came, I stepped outside immediately. The ground was damp again, and this time there were more footprints. They circled the tent completely, some stopping just inches from the entrance. My skin crawled at the thought of someone standing right there, staring at the thin nylon wall while we lay inside. There was no question anymore. We packed up as fast as we could. Neither of us spoke much while tearing down camp, both of us shaken and uneasy. The hike out felt longer than it should have. Every crack of a branch in the distance made me spin around, checking if someone was following us. My backpack felt heavier than it had on the way in, sweat soaking through my shirt even though the morning was cool. We didn't stop for water, didn't stop for rest, just kept moving until we finally reached the gravel lot where my car was parked. When we reached the car, there was one last detail that still unsettles me. On the hood of my car, faint but clear, was the outline of a dirty handprint. It wasn't ours. We hadn't touched the hood since we arrived. It looked smeared, as if someone leaned on the car or pressed their hand against it, watching the trail we had taken in. We threw our packs in the trunk and drove off without saying a word. Neither of us ever went back to that lake. Even now, years later, I can still hear those footsteps in the dark, slow and steady, circling closer and closer to our tent. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know for sure someone had been watching us out there, and they weren't just passing through. I went camping in the south of France in the summer of 2017. I was 27 then, living out of a backpack, moving between cheap hostels and quiet campsites. France had always been one of those places I imagined as warm, friendly, filled with vineyards, small villages, and old stone churches. I had been traveling alone for a few months, and I wanted to spend some nights out in nature instead of sleeping in noisy shared rooms. I bought a small used tent from a local shop in Avignon and a sleeping bag that looked worn but solid. From there, I took a bus to a small town near the Savin Mountains, planning to spend 3 or 4 nights hiking and sleeping in the woods. The weather was hot during the day, the kind that makes the air shimmer, but it cooled fast once the sun went down. I picked a quiet spot the first night, far enough off the trail so no one would stumble across me. The ground was uneven, covered in pine needles, but it felt private and safe. I ate bread, cheese, and dried sausage I had packed, drank from my water bottle, and sat until the last light faded. The forest was dense, alive with crickets and the rustling of small animals. It reminded me of camping trips back home, except here, everything felt a little more isolated, like I was further removed from help if something went wrong. The first night passed fine. I woke early, packed up, and hiked deeper into the hills. By the second night, I set up my tent near a clearing, where the trees opened enough to see the stars. It felt peaceful and I fell asleep quickly. It was the third night when things started to turn. I had walked longer that day, covering more ground than I planned. My shoulders ached under the straps of my pack, and my legs burned from the climbs. When I finally stopped, I was too tired to care about finding the perfect spot. I chose a place near a narrow stream, close to a rough dirt path. It wasn't as hidden as I usually liked, but I figured nobody would be hiking this late in the evening. By the time I had my tent up, the sun was gone, and the woods had settled into that deep, heavy quiet that comes after dusk. I ate in the dark, listening to the water trickle nearby. At some point, I must have dozed off sitting outside, because when I woke, the air was colder and the moon was high. That's when I heard its slow, deliberate footsteps on the dirt path. At first, I thought it was an animal. Wild boar were said to roam the area, and I imagined one pushing through the brush. But the sound was steady, too controlled. I froze, holding my breath. The steps grew louder, coming closer, crunching on loose gravel. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I ducked inside my tent, pulled the zipper almost shut, and lay flat on my stomach. My heart thumped so hard I thought it might give me away. Through the thin fabric, I could hear the footsteps stop just beyond where I had set up. Silence stretched for long seconds. Then, the sound of slow breathing, deep, heavy, as if someone stood just a few feet away. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My ears strained in the dark. After a while, the breathing shifted, followed by a faint scrape, like a boot dragging on rock. It circled my campsite, moving slowly, testing the ground. My skin prickled with cold sweat. Eventually, the footsteps drifted off, fading into the distance. I lay awake until dawn, every muscle tense, waiting for them to return. When the sun rose, I forced myself out of the tent. The dirt path was soft, and clear footprints ran right past my spot. They weren't animal tracks. They were shoes, heavy and large. I tried to convince myself it was just another hiker passing through, maybe stopping to catch his breath. But no hiker I had ever seen walked that late at night, and no hiker circled a tent without saying anything. I packed fast and hiked further into the hills, telling myself distance was safety. By midday, the air was blazing hot, and I found myself stumbling from fatigue. I drank sparingly from my water, ate a little, and tried to shake the unease from the night before. The fourth night, I picked a spot much deeper in the forest, far from the paths. It was rough terrain, but I felt better hidden. Still, as soon as the sun went down, my nerves fired again. Every sound seemed sharper. The crack of a branch, the rush of wind. I lay in my tent, wide awake, listening. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, careful this time, almost measured. They weren't on the path anymore. They were moving through the underbrush, crunching leaves, snapping twigs. My blood turned cold. Whoever it was had followed me off trail. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The steps came closer, stopping, starting again, circling. I could almost feel eyes on my tent. At one point, I heard a soft rustle, like fabric brushing against a branch. I imagined a man standing just outside, waiting for me to unzip the flap. Minutes dragged like hours. I kept telling myself not to make a sound. Finally, the steps faded again, moving off into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. By morning, I was done. I packed up with shaking hands, heart racing, and started heading toward the nearest village marked on my map. My food was low, my water almost gone, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get back to civilization. As I hiked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Twice, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a dark figure between the trunks, but when I stopped, it was gone. The trail narrowed, winding through thick forest. I walked fast, sweat dripping down my back, my neck stiff from looking around. The silence pressed in heavy, broken only by birds. Then I found something that stopped me cold. On a low branch, hanging at eye level, was a strip of fabric. Torn, dirty, maybe from a jacket. It swayed lightly in the breeze. The branch was just above my height. It wasn't there by accident. I didn't stay to examine it. I forced myself forward, almost jogging. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. But I didn't stop until I saw the rooftops of a small town below. When I reached the village, I went straight into the first cafe I saw, sweating, exhausted, shaking so badly I spilled water as I drank it. People glanced at me, but no one asked questions. I didn't tell them either. I just sat there for hours, letting my body calm down. That night, I booked a cheap room and locked the door. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the sounds in the woods. The breathing, the footsteps, the circling. I kept asking myself if it was some lost hiker, some farmer passing through. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became. It wasn't random. Whoever that man was, he had followed me. He had watched me move my camp. He had come back each night a little closer. I never went camping alone again after that trip. Even now, years later, when I think of those footsteps in the French woods, I feel that same cold grip in my stomach. I don't know what he wanted, and I'm glad I never found out. I was 24 when I decided to take a camping trip on my own in the summer of 2011. I had gone camping with friends before, but never completely alone. Part of me wanted the silence, the space, the separation from everything that kept me distracted in daily life. I had been living in Lyon for a few months, and the stress of work had built up more than I realized. I picked a forested area outside of Grenoble, a place I had seen mentioned in an online forum about quiet hiking trails. It wasn't a big campground with lots of families around. It was more of a stretch of land where people could pitch a tent if they wanted. A mixture of forest, open clearings, and narrow paths that led deeper into the woods. I left the city in the late afternoon with my backpack, tent, a couple bottles of water, dried food, and a small folding chair strapped to the side. The air was humid but cooler as I moved closer to the mountains. By the time I parked my car near a dirt road and began walking in, the sun was dipping low. I wasn't worried. I had done this before, and I liked the calm that came when the air cooled and the forest started to darken. I found a small clearing just off the trail. It wasn't perfectly flat, but it was good enough for a single tent. I set everything up quickly, hammered down the stakes, and unrolled my sleeping bag inside. As I sat there, listening to the rustling of leaves overhead, I felt that mix of peace and alertness that only comes from being alone outdoors. Every sound stands out when you don't have someone else talking nearby. The snapping of twigs, the occasional bird, even the distant rush of water somewhere past the trees. The first hour or two passed quietly. I ate some food out of a small plastic bag, just bread and cheese I had packed, and watched the sky turn from pale blue to gray. The forest changed as it got darker. The insects grew louder, their buzzing and chirping filling the space in waves. Shadows stretched across the clearing, and every movement at the edge of my vision looked like something larger than it really was. I sat still in the chair for a while, staring into the trees, and then finally decided to crawl inside the tent before it got completely dark. I thought I would fall asleep easily, but the quiet pressed harder against me when I lay down. It wasn't absolute silence. It never is in the woods, but every sound carried differently. Something moved in the brush, a sharp, short crack like a heavy step. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a wild boar further away. I closed my eyes and waited, my body tense against the thin floor of the tent. A while later, I woke up without realizing I had fallen asleep. It was still night, the tent faintly lit by the moon through the fabric. My mouth was dry, so I reached for my water bottle and took a drink. That's when I heard it again. The crunch of leaves, slow and heavy. It wasn't constant, came in steps, spaced out like something or someone moving with caution. My stomach tightened. Animals made noise, sure, but this didn't sound like the random shuffling of an animal rooting around. It sounded measured. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the water bottle in my hand. The sound circled faintly around the clearing. My heartbeat grew so loud I thought I might not be able to hear anything else. After a few minutes, the steps stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, just past where I could see. I must have lain there for another hour, eyes open, barely blinking. My body ached from not moving, but I was too afraid to shift. Finally, exhaustion dragged me under again. When I woke, it was early morning. The light was pale but clear enough to see through the tent walls. I unzipped the flap and stepped outside, stiff from the night. The first thing I noticed was the ground. There were impressions in the dirt and pine needles, marks that hadn't been there when I set up camp. At first I thought they might be animal tracks, but the shapes were off. They weren't clear prints, more like places where weight had pressed down unevenly, the kind you'd see from boots dragging slightly. I scanned the area and my skin prickled. Whoever or whatever had been out there had circled my tent. I tried to calm myself by telling myself it could have been another camper passing through. Maybe they had been curious. Maybe they walked close without realizing someone was asleep inside the tent. I forced myself to eat a little breakfast, though my stomach turned the whole time. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but the unease stayed sharp in my chest. I spent part of the day hiking a little further from camp, trying to distract myself. The woods were beautiful in daylight, tall trees breaking into patches of sun, the occasional wildflowers near the trail, the distant hum of insects. But even then, I couldn't shake the thought of those steps. I kept glancing behind me, scanning the trail. At one point, I thought I saw movement far back between the trees, a flicker of something pale, but when I stared harder, there was nothing. By the time evening came again, I almost packed up to leave. Something told me it would be stupid to stay another night, but the hike back to the car felt longer than I wanted to do with the light fading. I convinced myself to hold on, that I was overthinking. I cooked a small meal over a little camp stove and tried to stay awake until I felt heavy enough to sleep without worrying. It didn't work. Around midnight, I woke up again, heart pounding before I even knew why. Then I heard it, the same crunch of steps, slow, heavy, deliberate. Closer this time. I held my breath, eyes wide in the dark. The sound stopped just outside the thin nylon wall of the tent. I could hear breathing, not animal breathing, not fast or shallow, but steady. Human. My entire body froze. The weight shifted outside, and I swore I saw the shadow of legs through the faint moonlight against the tent wall. My throat went dry. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever, not moving, not making a sound beyond that calm breathing. Then, just as slowly as they had come, the steps started again, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there until the first streaks of morning light broke through. My decision was instant. I shoved everything into my backpack without folding it properly, tore the stakes from the ground, and stuffed the tent in loose. My hands shook the whole time. I hiked out faster than I thought I could move, checking behind me every few minutes. When I reached my car, I tossed my gear in and locked the doors immediately. My chest hurt from holding my breath so much, but I didn't let myself relax until I was on the highway back toward the city. I didn't care if it made me seem weak or paranoid. Something or someone had been there that night. They hadn't tried to hide it. They had circled, stopped, and stood close enough for me to hear them breathe. I never camped alone again after that. Even with friends, I find myself lying awake sometimes, listening for footsteps that aren't there, watching for shadows against the tent wall. That night outside Grenoble reminded me that the scariest thing in the woods isn't the wild animals or the dark. It's the possibility of another person, watching, waiting, and choosing not to show their face. I took my dog, Scout, out camping deep in the Smoky Mountains back in the summer of 2013. I was 27 at the time and had gotten into the habit of escaping the city on weekends, leaving behind the noise and the screens for the woods. Scout was a 2-year-old German Shepherd then, full of energy, loyal to the bone, and stubborn when he got curious. I'd picked a spot along an old, less-used trail that I'd read about online. Supposedly quiet, tucked between 2 ridges and away from the usual family campgrounds. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive itself took most of the afternoon, winding roads cutting through towns that looked half abandoned, the kind where the gas stations had hand-painted signs and the houses leaned a little too far off their foundations. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already low. I parked my old Ford Ranger, strapped my pack, clipped Scout's leash, and started the hike in. The woods were thicker than I expected. The air was damp and heavy, the kind that sticks to your clothes and makes every breath feel like you're pulling it through wet cloth. Scout trotted ahead, nose down, pulling me along like he always did. The trail wound upward, then dipped sharply into a hollow where a small stream cut through. It took me about an hour and a half to find a flat clearing just above the stream. It wasn't an official campsite, but it had the kind of space you look for. A patch of dirt without too many roots, some tree cover, and a bit of distance from the water to avoid bugs. I set up my small green tent, unrolled the sleeping bag, and started a fire with the bundle of sticks I'd gathered on the way in. The firelight made the clearing feel smaller, almost claustrophobic, the trees closing in like black walls. Scout stayed close, lying on his stomach with his head up, ears twitching at every crackle in the distance. I cooked some sausage links over the fire and split half with him. By the time night fully dropped, the woods were alive with sound. Crickets, frogs, and something larger moving through the brush far off. I tried to relax, but Scout wouldn't settle. He kept staring past the fire into the dark, low growls slipping from his chest now and then. First, I thought it was just deer. They're everywhere in those mountains, and the smell of cooked food would draw them close. But Scout had hunted deer scent before, and his body language was different this time. His fur bristled, his head stayed locked on one spot behind the tree line, and when he growled, it wasn't playful or curious. It was sharp, protective. I took my flashlight and shined it out past the fire. The beam only caught tangled branches and wet leaves, reflecting back like shards of glass. Nothing moved, nothing visible. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or maybe a black bear wandering near the stream. I kept the fire fed, let Scout curl up closer to me, and after a while, exhaustion won out. Sometime in the night, I woke to Scout barking. Not just barking, snapping, furious, the kind of bark I'd only heard when another dog had charged us at the park once. I sat up, heart hammering, and saw his silhouette at the edge of the tent door. I unzipped it fast, grabbed my flashlight, and shined it where he was focused. That's when I saw them. Eyes not glowing like some wild animal in the dark, but reflecting in the beam, set low, close together. They didn't dart away like a deer or shine high like a bear. They just stared. I felt the hair on my neck rise. Scout lunged against his leash, teeth bared. And that's when I realized it wasn't just one set of eyes. There were more. 3, maybe 4. The light caught movement, slow, deliberate, crouched. Not rushing, not fleeing, just watching. I froze, trying to make sense of it. My mind went to feral dogs first. Packs of strays weren't common this deep in the mountains, but it wasn't impossible. Then another thought hit me: people. Squatters, drifters, whoever lives way out in places nobody checks. My gut twisted at that thought worse than any wild animal would have. I shouted, hoping the noise would scare them off, but the shapes didn't move. They stayed low, half hidden behind the underbrush. Scout barked so hard I thought he'd snap the leash, his claws digging trenches in the dirt. I fumbled for the hatchet I'd packed, the only real weapon I had, and kept the flashlight steady. Slowly, the figures shifted back into the trees, slipping out of sight without a sound. No crunch of leaves, no breaking branches. Just gone. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat by the fire with Scout, gripping the hatchet until my hand cramped, feeding sticks to the flames to keep them alive. Every few minutes, I'd hear something out there. Footsteps, or maybe my brain making things up. The woods stretched on forever in every direction, and the thought of people creeping just beyond the firelight made my chest feel like it was caving in. At first light, I didn't waste a second. I stuffed the sleeping bag back in the pack, broke down the tent half folded, and loaded everything in a rush. My hands shook the whole time, not from the cold but from the leftover adrenaline. Scout never relaxed either. He kept glancing back toward the tree line as if he expected them to step out any second. The hike back to the truck felt twice as long. The woods looked different in daylight, calmer, less menacing, but I couldn't shake the thought of being watched. Every crow call made me jump. Every snapping twig twisted my stomach. Scout pulled the leash hard the entire way, head swinging side to side, tail stiff and low. When I finally reached the truck, the relief hit me like a wave. I tossed the gear in the back, opened the door for Scout, and peeled out down that dirt road faster than I should have. I kept checking the rearview mirror for miles, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. I didn't stop until I hit a diner an hour away, parked where the lot was full, and sat inside with Scout at my feet, eating eggs and toast while trying to process it all. The waitress asked if I'd been camping, and I just nodded, not trusting my voice. Even now, years later, I can still picture those eyes in the dark. Not wild, not startled, but deliberate, watching me. I haven't camped alone since that night. I still go, but only to established campgrounds, places with other people close by, and I always make sure Scout is with me. I trust his instincts more than my own. That night taught me something I never forgot. The scariest thing in the woods isn't the bears, or the storms, or even getting lost. It's knowing that someone else might be out there, hiding just far enough away, deciding what to do with you while you sit in the dark with no walls and no doors. And the worst part is you never really know if they leave when you think they do. I was 24 when I decided to take a short camping trip alone in the late fall of 2017. I had just finished a tough month at work and needed some quiet time to myself. I drove out to a forested area in southern Oregon, a place I had read about online that had simple campgrounds and thick pine trees that stretched for miles. It wasn't the type of place that attracted many people in late autumn, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed light but made sure I had the basics: tent, sleeping bag, food, flashlight, and some firewood in the back of my car. By the time I parked at the trailhead, it was already late afternoon. The air had that sharp chill that always comes before rain. The dirt path into the woods was damp and scattered with fallen pine needles that muffled the sound of my boots. I found a small clearing about a mile in, far enough from the main path but open enough to pitch my tent. I set everything up quickly, drove the stakes into the ground, and stacked the firewood under a tarp in case it rained. By dusk, the sky was already turning heavy with gray clouds. The forest grew darker much faster than I expected. I built a fire and heated a small pot of soup while listening to the faint patter of rain starting to sprinkle through the branches. At first, it was calming. The mix of smoke from the fire and the smell of wet pine needles gave the air a damp, earthy heaviness. I felt a rare calm sitting out there with no noise of cars, no phone ringing, nothing but the slow build of rain and the occasional crack from the fire. But by the time the sun was fully gone, the rain turned harder. It drummed against the tent fabric and hissed when it hit the fire. I knew the fire wouldn't last, so I finished my soup, zipped everything I didn't need into my backpack, and crawled into my tent. Inside, the rain sounded much louder, constant and pressing, like someone shaking the fabric from all sides. I laid in my sleeping bag listening to it and checking my watch every so often. Around 11, I noticed another sound mixed in with the rain. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting through the trees, but then it repeated, slower and heavier. It was the sound of boots stepping into wet soil. I froze. My tent was closed, and there was no light inside, but I could hear it. Clear, heavy footfalls. Not close at first, but moving with a deliberate pace, one step at a time. The forest had been empty when I arrived, and I hadn't seen a single car at the trailhead. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here in this storm. My heart started to pound hard in my chest as I held my breath, straining to listen over the rain. The steps grew closer. I imagined someone walking through the trees, soaked from head to toe, heading straight toward my camp. I slowly reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I lay there, staring at the thin fabric of the tent wall, waiting for any shadow or shape. The steps slowed down, then stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. Rain hammered down, but there was no movement anymore, no crunch of soil or needles. I could only hear my own breathing. Minutes dragged on. My body was rigid, every muscle tight, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard a new sound, something scraping lightly against wood. My firewood. I had stacked it under the tarp near the tent. It sounded like someone was shifting the pieces, maybe picking one up. The tarp flapped slightly, and I knew I wasn't imagining it. I considered unzipping the tent and shining the flashlight out, but fear pinned me still. My mind raced with images of a stranger standing in the rain, watching my camp, maybe armed. I gripped a small camping knife I had left near my sleeping bag and waited, barely blinking. After what felt like forever, the noise stopped. For another half hour, I lay there listening. Nothing but rain. Finally, exhausted, I must have drifted off into a shallow, restless sleep. When I woke, it was still dark, though my watch said it was nearly 5 in the morning. The rain had eased into a lighter drizzle. I unzipped the tent slowly, shining the flashlight around. The ground was slick with mud and pine needles stuck to everything. The first thing I noticed was the tarp over the firewood. It had been pulled halfway off. Several logs were scattered on the ground, wet and muddy. That wasn't the way I left it. I looked around carefully. There were boot prints in the soft earth, deep enough to show clearly despite the rain. They circled near the tarp and then led off into the trees. My chest tightened as I followed them with the light. They didn't look like fresh hiking boots, more like worn work boots, wide and heavy. They trailed off into the woods in a crooked line, disappearing into the wet needles and mud. I didn't stick around to make breakfast. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my hands trembling the whole time. Every snap of a branch in the distance made me whip my head around. I stuffed my wet tent into the bag, shoved everything else into my pack, and headed straight back to the trailhead. The walk back was nerve-wracking. The forest looked darker than it had when I came in, every tree trunk thick and shadowy. I kept glancing behind me, convinced I'd see someone following. The prints appeared again along the path at one point, pressed into the mud, as if whoever it was had come from the same direction I was heading now. That made me move faster. By the time I saw my car, the sky was a pale gray and the drizzle was steady again. My relief at seeing it nearly buckled my knees. I threw my gear into the trunk and got inside, locking the doors immediately. My hands were still shaking as I turned the ignition. Before I pulled out, I scanned the tree line one last time. I saw nothing but dripping branches and the wet blur of pine needles swaying. On the drive back into town, I couldn't stop thinking about the prints and the sound of someone messing with my firewood in the middle of the night. Whoever it was hadn't tried to speak, hadn't shown a light, hadn't made their presence known in any normal way. They just walked into my camp in the pouring rain and lingered there silently. That thought alone unsettled me more than anything else. When I finally got home, I dumped my wet gear in the corner and sat on my couch for nearly an hour, still in my damp clothes, trying to calm down. I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The prints, the tarp, the scattered logs, they proved it. Someone had been out there, in the rain, walking around my camp, watching silently while I lay in my tent. I never went back to that forest again. I was 26 years old in the summer of 2011 when I decided to drive out to Wyoming for a week of camping. I had been working too many hours at a warehouse job, and the noise of forklifts and machines had been grinding me down. I wanted to be alone, far away from people, far away from the constant hum of work and traffic. I had camped before, though never that deep into the backcountry. My plan was simple. Park near the trailhead outside of Du Bois, hike out along a river, and set up camp in a quiet spot where no one could bother me. The first few days went well. The air was dry and clean, the smell of pine sharp and earthy, and the nights were cool but not too cold. I set up my tent about a quarter mile from the water so the sound of the current reached me faintly at night. During the day, I fished, wandered through meadows, and cooked simple meals on my little stove. Everything felt calm, the kind of calm you can't buy. By the third night, things shifted. That evening, the sky turned red and purple as the sun went down, and the wind picked up harder than usual. I ate quickly, cleaned my gear, and settled inside my tent before dark. As I lay on my sleeping pad, I heard something strange. Not the river, not the wind, but a crack like a branch breaking. It was sharp, like weight had snapped it, not just the breeze pushing. I froze for a few seconds, listening hard. At first I thought it might have been an elk or deer, but the sound didn't repeat. I let myself relax, but it stuck in my head. Later that night, I woke up again. The air inside the tent was colder, and everything was quiet except for my own breathing. Then I caught another sound. This time it was footsteps, heavy, slow, crunching in the pine needles. Not an animal padding softly, but something that sounded more deliberate, like boots. They moved close, then stopped. My chest tightened. I stayed still, staring into the darkness of the tent fabric, trying to hear better. After what felt like forever, I heard them again, but this time moving away, fading back into the trees until there was nothing but the wind again. I barely slept after that. In the morning, I tried to brush it off as maybe a big animal or my imagination. Still, when I walked out of my tent, I noticed the ground nearby was disturbed. Not paw prints. They looked more like the edges of a boot sole pressed into the dirt. The soil was too dry to catch detail, but the shape stuck with me. I told myself it could have been there before I set up camp, though I didn't believe it. That day, I decided to fish farther upstream to put some distance between me and the unease. Hours went by without trouble, but on the hike back, I got this heavy feeling like someone was watching me. Every time I turned around, the trail was empty, just trees swaying in the breeze. I tried to move faster, and by the time I reached camp, sweat was sticking my shirt to my back. That night, I barely touched dinner. I kept checking the tree line around my tent and listening for anything unusual. I finally crawled into the tent, zipped the door tight, and sat there with my flashlight in my hand. Around midnight, the noises returned. A stick snapped, then slow crunching steps circled wide around the tent. They paused, then came closer, then stopped again. The air in the tent felt too tight, and I could hear my own heart thudding in my ears. At one point, something brushed against the side of the tent, soft, but steady enough that it wasn't just the wind. I held my breath, then silence. I waited what must have been an hour, sitting upright with the flashlight clenched in my fist, until exhaustion finally pulled me down. In the morning, I found something that erased all doubt. Near the fire pit I had built, pressed into the dirt, was the clear tread of a boot. It wasn't mine. The sole had a broken edge, worn down unevenly, like an old work boot. It led from the woods toward my tent, then back again. I knew right then I wasn't alone out there. Someone was messing with me, or worse, watching. I packed fast, shoving my gear into the backpack without caring about order. My hands shook as I collapsed the tent poles. I started hiking back toward the trailhead with the sun still low in the sky. The whole way, I felt eyes on me. The forest was too quiet. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I swore I could hear movement. A shuffle, a faint snap in the underbrush, like someone keeping pace just out of sight. I never saw anyone, but the tension never let up. Hours later, when the parking lot finally came into view, my stomach dropped. My truck sat alone in the gravel, but across the lot, near the tree line, was a shape. A man, standing just far enough back that his face was shadowed by branches. He wore a jacket, dirty jeans, and boots. He didn't move, didn't call out, didn't wave, just stood there. I stared at him for maybe 10 seconds, then unlocked my truck and threw my bag inside. My hands fumbled the keys, and when I finally got the engine running, I looked back. The spot was empty. I drove straight out, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, not stopping until I hit the main highway. I didn't care about the gear still scattered in the back or the food I left behind. I just wanted out. I never went back to that part of Wyoming. Even now, years later, I still think about those nights. I wonder how long he had been watching, if he'd followed me from the moment I hiked in, or if he stumbled across my camp by chance. I'll never know if he meant to harm me or just enjoyed scaring me. But I do know this: the wilderness feels different when you realize it isn't just animals out there. Sometimes it's people, and people can be worse. That trip cured me of solo camping. The quiet, the peace I thought I wanted. It doesn't feel the same after staring at a boot print that isn't yours. Every time I think of the crunch of those steps circling my tent in the dark, I feel the same cold knot in my stomach. Out there, miles from help, all it would have taken was a zipper pulling open in the night. I was lucky nothing more happened, but the fear of what could have happened is something I still carry, heavier than any pack I've ever shouldered. I was 34 when I decided to spend a long weekend hunting alone in the mountains of northern Idaho. It was October of 2011, late enough in the year that the mornings froze my breath into small clouds and the ground was hard with frost, but still early enough that there wasn't heavy snow yet. I had been hunting since I was a kid with my father and uncles, but this trip was the first I planned alone. I wanted the quiet, the challenge, and the feeling of being cut off from everything. I packed carefully, brought more food than I thought I would need, and made sure to have a good map, a GPS, and a small emergency radio. I parked my truck at a trailhead about 2 hours outside a small town. The road ended in a gravel clearing surrounded by tall pines. It was already late afternoon when I hiked in, the sun dipping lower behind the ridges. painting the sky with pale orange. The forest smelled like wet leaves and pitch, and every step crunched with fallen needles. My pack weighed heavy with gear, rifle strapped along the side, but I liked the feeling. It made me feel steady, prepared. By the time I reached a small clearing about 3 miles in, the light had nearly gone. I pitched my tent quickly, using the last light to gather wood for a fire. The night settled cold and black around me. The first night wasn't anything unusual. The forest was alive with distant sounds. An owl calling, branches shifting in the wind, the occasional crack that could have been a deer moving in the dark. I felt the old familiar nervousness I always did when the world closed in around me, when it was just me and thin fabric walls between everything else. But it was manageable. The second day I rose early. Frost clung to my tent's zipper and my water bottle had a thin sheet of ice on top. I boiled coffee over the small stove and ate jerky, then packed lightly and headed out to hunt. The morning light slanted low through the trees, turning the mist into bright streaks. The forest was quiet except for my boots breaking sticks beneath me. I moved carefully, following faint game trails. After a few hours, I spotted fresh deer tracks in the mud near a stream. My pulse quickened, the same old rush I'd known since I was a boy. I trailed those prints for most of the day, sometimes losing them in thick brush, then finding them again along the damp ground. Around mid-afternoon, I thought I caught sight of movement, tan against the trees, but when I lifted my rifle and steadied it, nothing appeared. The forest felt oddly still in that moment, like it was holding its breath. I let it pass and kept moving, though I marked the spot in my mind. When evening came, I headed back toward camp. The sun fell quick behind the ridge, shadows stretching long. I reached camp just as the cold set in. I started a fire and cooked a small meal, canned beans mixed with rice. The flames kept me company as the woods around me darkened. I sat there for a while, just staring into the fire and listening to the woods. That night, I didn't sleep well. I woke up several times to faint noises. Not the normal kind, not the rustle of animals going about their lives. These were heavier, slower, sometimes pausing for long stretches. Once, I thought I heard a branch snap somewhere too close. I told myself it was elk or maybe even a bear moving through. Still, I kept my rifle close inside the tent. The third day, I tried to shake it off. I went out again, followed a ridge, and glassed the valley below with my binoculars. The day was gray, with low clouds hanging heavy. I didn't see much game. Around midday, while I was crouched near a deadfall, I heard something strange. It was a whistle, not a bird call, not the high, thin song of nature, but short, sharp, human. It carried faint through the trees, maybe 100 yards off. I froze. I wasn't anywhere near the usual hiking paths. This deep, you rarely saw anyone, especially not in October. I waited, crouched low, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No voices followed. No sound of boots on the ground. Just silence again, thick and pressing. My skin prickled. I stayed still for several minutes, then slowly backed out, keeping my rifle ready. I returned to camp earlier than I'd planned that day, uneasy. At camp, I built my fire higher than usual, its smoke curling into the gray sky. I wanted light, warmth, something to hold the dark at bay. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were clearer. Slow steps circling just outside the firelight, pausing, then continuing. My tent felt like a trap, but the thought of stepping outside into the black woods was worse. I sat inside, back against my pack, rifle across my lap, every muscle tight. The steps moved away at some point, but I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I had decided I would cut the trip short. Hunting alone was one thing. Feeling like something or someone was stalking me was another. I packed slowly, keeping alert. I left some firewood stacked neatly, a habit of mine, though my hands shook as I did it. I started down the trail toward the truck, moving steady but fast, ears tuned for every sound. A mile in, I found something that stopped me cold. In the middle of the trail, laid neat across the dirt, was a small bundle of sticks tied together with twine. It hadn't been there before. It was shaped almost like a little cross, bound tight. I stared at it for a long time, heart thudding hard. Someone had been there. Someone had left it, and they had done it while I was out or while I was sleeping. I didn't touch it. I stepped wide around it and kept moving. The forest no longer felt like the same place I'd entered days before. Every tree seemed like it could hide someone watching. Every bend in the trail felt like a trap. I pushed myself harder, legs burning, pack biting into my shoulders. When I finally saw the pale outline of the gravel clearing through the trees, I almost ran. My truck sat alone where I had left it, frost still on the windows. I threw my pack in the back, climbed inside, and locked the doors before even starting the engine. I sat there for a moment, hands tight on the wheel, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, just the same quiet forest. The drive back down the mountain felt endless. Every curve of the dirt road seemed to hide something. My eyes flicked constantly to the rearview mirror. When I finally reached the highway and saw another car pass, relief hit me hard. I never told anyone the full story. I said I cut the trip short because of the weather. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw on the trail. Someone was out there watching me walking near my camp at night, leaving things behind. Hunting alone had always been about silence and freedom for me, but after that trip, I never went out by myself again. The woods are big, and most of the time they hold only animals and wind. But sometimes there's someone else in them, someone who doesn't want to be seen, and that's far worse than any bear or wolf I could ever run into. I went camping alone once in the summer of 2013. I was 24 at the time, and I had been looking for some quiet away from the city. I lived in Colorado back then, and the mountains always pulled me in. I had done several day hikes, but rarely stayed out overnight by myself. Something about the stillness of the woods at night had always unsettled me. Still, I wanted to test myself. I wanted to prove that I could handle the quiet, the isolation, and whatever else came with it. I picked a spot about 2 miles off a small dirt road that branched off the main highway. It wasn't a well-known trail, which made it appealing. I figured the fewer people around, the better. I parked my old Toyota at the side of the road, packed my gear, and started walking through the thick pines until I reached a clearing where a stream cut through the trees. It seemed like the perfect spot. Flat ground, water nearby, and enough cover that I wouldn't feel exposed. I set up my small 2-person tent on a patch of soft ground and built a little fire ring out of rocks I gathered from the creek. It was late afternoon, warm but not hot, and the air smelled of sap and earth. I made some instant noodles on my small stove, ate slowly, and watched the shadows stretch out across the clearing. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, I had settled into the quiet. The first few hours of night were easier than I expected. I kept the fire small but steady, listening to the trickle of water and the occasional rustle of branches. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I felt proud of myself. It was different being alone like that. No city noise, no people, just the weight of silence pressing down from every side. At some point deep in the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. The tent was pitch black, and my heart was already beating fast. Then I realized I had heard something outside. A crunch, faint but sharp, like a boot on dry twigs. My first thought was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but then it happened again, slower this time, deliberate. One step, pause, then another. I lay frozen in my bag, every sense wide open. The sound wasn't far. It was right outside the clearing, maybe 20 feet away. I told myself it was probably nothing, just the woods playing tricks, animals doing their thing. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became that this wasn't random. The steps were spaced apart, careful, as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. I didn't move. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't dare grab it. The tent walls felt paper thin, like whoever was outside could see me through them. For a few minutes, the steps circled the area. I could hear branches snapping softly, leaves being pushed aside. Then silence. Nothing. I lay there with my muscles tense, straining to catch the smallest sound. When the quiet dragged on, I thought maybe I had imagined it. My body eventually gave out, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. In the morning, I stepped out into the clearing. The fire pit was just ashes, the sun already bright in the sky. I scanned the tree line, my stomach tight. I noticed right away what had changed: fresh boot prints in the damp soil near the creek. They weren't mine. The tread was different, wider, heavier. They led from the trees toward my camp, looped around the back of my tent, and then disappeared back into the woods. My chest felt hollow when I saw that. Someone had been there, watching me while I slept. I wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but pride and stubbornness held me there. Maybe it was a hunter passing through, I told myself. Maybe someone curious. I tried to shake it off, though the unease stuck to me like glue. I spent the day fishing in the stream and hiking a bit along the ridge, pretending everything was normal. But when evening came, the dread came with it. I built another fire, bigger this time, hoping the light would keep anything away. I kept my hunting knife at my side and my hatchet within reach. The forest felt different now. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. Every shadow looked like someone crouching low. Around midnight, I heard it again. The same steady crunch of boots coming from the trees. This time closer, bolder. My hands were shaking as I gripped the knife, sitting upright inside the tent. The fire outside had burned low, but the faint glow cast long shapes across the clearing. I couldn't see anything through the tent walls, only here. The steps came all the way to the edge of the clearing, then stopped. I held my breath so hard my chest ached. A long pause followed, then the faint sound of breathing, slow, heavy, human. That was the moment I knew it wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, knife clutched in my fist, my eyes fixed on the tent door. I considered unzipping it and shining my flashlight out, but fear pinned me down. I imagined the light catching a face staring back at me from the dark. I couldn't do it. After a long time, the breathing faded. The steps retreated, careful again, fading into the trees until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat upright until dawn, my ears ringing from the silence. When daylight came, I didn't waste a second. I stuffed my sleeping bag, collapsed the tent, and packed everything as fast as I could. My heart jumped when I saw more footprints in the mud, fresh ones circling the camp again. Whoever it was had come closer this time. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started walking fast, following the creek back toward the road. The forest seemed endless, every tree hiding a figure that might step out at me. My neck ached from looking back so often. Halfway back, I found something that made my stomach drop. A crushed cigarette, but still damp with spit, sitting on a rock near the trail. I hadn't smoked in years, and there was no way it had been there long. Whoever had been circling my camp had followed me part of the way back. I didn't run, though I wanted to. I forced myself to keep moving, one step after another, until I finally saw the glint of my truck through the trees. Relief washed over me so hard I almost stumbled. I tossed my gear in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before starting the engine. When the tires hit the main road, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding for hours. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, but I kept driving until I was miles away from that place. I never went back to that spot. I didn't even tell anyone the full story for years. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some drifter messing with me, maybe something worse. But what stuck with me more than anything was the thought of how close they had been. Standing just a few feet away from me in the dark, while I sat frozen inside that thin nylon tent. That night taught me something important. The woods themselves don't scare me anymore. It's not the animals or the darkness or the silence. It's the people you don't see, the ones who move quiet and careful, who watch when you're most vulnerable. That's what stays with you long after you leave. I was 23 when I did something I had no real reason to do, other than to prove a point to myself. It was early October, 2017, a few weeks after my birthday, when the air started to cool down and nights became sharper. I had been reading about local legends and dares people would talk about, the kind of things you heard in late-night conversations or online forums. One of those things was camping in a graveyard. Everyone always laughed it off or tried to make it sound supernatural, but I wasn't interested in ghosts or any of that. I just wanted to test my nerves, to see if I could handle being alone in a place that made most people uncomfortable. The graveyard I chose was on the edge of a small town in upstate New York, outside of Utica. It wasn't abandoned, but it was old, and not many people visited anymore except on Memorial Day or to maintain the grounds. A 2-lane road cut past its entrance, but once you went in and followed the gravel path, you were surrounded by tall, leaning headstones, small mausoleums, and uneven ground covered in leaves. I drove there late in the evening around 7:30, just as the sun was dropping. My car was an old Honda with the trunk half broken, but it was enough to carry a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a flashlight. I remember my hands sweating even as I zipped up my jacket and looked around before unloading my stuff. The graveyard was silent except for the sound of crickets and the occasional passing car in the distance. The further I walked in, the less even that faded noise reached me. I found a spot under a tall oak tree, close to a line of old stones that dated back to the 1800s. Their writing faded and hard to read. The grass was patchy, damp in places, and the ground felt uneven under my boots. I laid my tent flat and pushed the stakes in, the small metallic clicks echoing more than I expected in the still air. By the time I finished setting up, the last light was gone and the sky had turned a deep navy. No street lamps or nearby houses to brighten the area. Inside the tent, I unrolled my sleeping bag and placed my backpack near the corner. I had brought snacks, jerky, a bottle of water, and some granola bars. My flashlight beam lit up the fabric walls in a dull glow, but I didn't want to keep it on too much, afraid the battery would drain. Outside, the air had turned colder. I could hear the dry leaves brushing against each other every time the wind moved. At first, everything felt normal the way it does when you camp anywhere. The silence, the rustle, the loneliness. It was all expected, but as the night deepened, I started noticing how different the quiet was here compared to a forest or a field. In the woods, there's always some kind of sound. An animal moving, branches snapping, distant owls. Here, it felt like everything was holding its breath. Every small noise stood out too much, as if it didn't belong. I lay back in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin fabric ceiling. My body was tense even though I tried to relax. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Not heavy ones, but the distinct crunch of weight pressing on dead leaves. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or stray dog. But the sound was too steady, too evenly spaced. It stopped and started again, closer this time. My throat felt tight as I sat up, trying not to make any sudden sound. I turned off the flashlight and sat in complete darkness, straining my ears. The steps moved along the row of stones, then paused. I didn't move. My tent was only a thin layer of fabric, no real protection. I imagined someone standing just outside, looking at it, waiting. The air inside grew warm from my breathing, and I had to force myself to slow it down. After a few minutes, the footsteps shifted away, fading toward the far side of the graveyard. I waited longer, maybe half an hour, before daring to unzip the tent just a little. The air outside was freezing, my breath a pale mist. I scanned the area, but saw nothing. The rows of gravestones looked like crooked teeth in the dim moonlight, shadows stretching long across the ground. No movement, no sound. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe even another person cutting through the graveyard on their way somewhere. That thought wasn't much better, but at least it was an explanation. I zipped the tent back up and forced myself to lie down again, though I couldn't close my eyes. Every sound seemed sharper now. The groan of the oak tree above, the scuttle of something small in the grass, the faint whistle of wind. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, this time faster, as if someone was jogging through. They passed by my tent, so close that I could hear the leaves shift just a few feet away. My skin crawled, and I pressed myself against the ground as if it would make me invisible. The steps faded again, but I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent and crawled out quietly, holding my flashlight in my hand but not turning it on. My eyes adjusted to the moonlight, enough to see the outlines of stones and the oak branches swaying. The air was so cold now my fingers stung. I looked around, scanning every direction, but saw nothing. That was when I noticed something strange. Toward the far edge of the graveyard, near the tree line, I saw a small pile of items. At first, I thought it was just trash someone left behind, but as I crept closer, I realized it was arranged. A broken lantern, an old blanket, and a few empty cans. It looked like someone had been staying there, hidden among the stones, living in the graveyard. My stomach dropped as it hit me that the footsteps weren't random. I wasn't alone out here. Someone else was using this place to sleep or hide, and I had pitched my tent right in their space. I backed away slowly, every nerve in my body screaming to run. But I didn't want to make noise. I walked back toward my tent, packed up what I could quickly, shoving things into my bag without caring how they fit. My hands shook so bad I could barely pull the stakes from the ground. Once I had everything stuffed into my backpack, I slung it over my shoulder and headed straight for the gravel path without looking back. The walk to the car felt like the longest I had ever taken. Every step I expected to hear someone behind me. When I reached the road and saw the outline of my car, my chest nearly collapsed with relief. I threw my stuff inside, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors instantly. My headlights cut across the graves as I started the engine, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing by the oak tree where my tent had been. I didn't stop to check. I drove off, tires spitting gravel, not slowing down until I hit the main road. That night taught me something. It wasn't ghosts or spirits that made graveyards terrifying. It was the real people who used them, the ones who didn't want to be seen, the ones who had nowhere else to go or had their own reasons for being out there in the dark. I went looking for a thrill, but what I found was a reminder that danger is usually flesh and blood, not something out of a story. I've never camped in a graveyard again, and I never will. I remember that hunting trip like it was yesterday, even though years have passed. It was the fall of 2004. I had just turned 30, and I wanted to get away from the noise of the city for a few days. I had hunted before, but mostly small trips with friends or family. This time, I wanted something different. I wanted to go alone, spend a few nights in the woods, and see if I could push myself a little further. I chose an area in northern Minnesota, far from the main roads, deep enough into the forest where people rarely went unless they had a reason. I parked my old pickup at a small clearing near a dirt trail and hiked in with my gear. I carried a rifle, a pack with food and water, a small tent, a sleeping bag, and a few essentials. The walk-in was calm at first, the air crisp and cold, the leaves under my boots crunching with every step. The sun was dipping low behind the trees, orange light cutting through the branches, and I remember thinking how perfect it looked. I had been looking forward to this for months, and finally, I had the chance to sit under the stars without anyone around. By the time I set up camp, it was dark. I built a small fire, cooked a bit of canned food, and sat with the rifle across my knees. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional rustle in the leaves from small animals. Every sound out there feels louder when you're alone, and though I tried to ignore it, my eyes kept darting into the darkness, half expecting something bigger to emerge. Nothing did that first night. I eventually crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and fell asleep listening to the faint crackling of the fire. The next morning, I woke up early, before the sun rose and started moving. I wanted to cover some ground and maybe spot a deer. The forest felt damp, fog hanging low, my breath visible in the air. I walked quietly, scanning the ground for tracks, pausing often to listen. I didn't see much at first, just squirrels and the occasional rabbit darting through the brush. After hours of walking, I finally found deer tracks, fresh ones pressed into the soft dirt near a stream. I followed them deeper into the woods. As I walked further, I noticed how the woods started to feel heavier. The trees were packed tighter, less sunlight breaking through, and the air seemed still, like the wind didn't reach here. I told myself it was just the thickness of the forest, but something about it made me uneasy. Still, I kept going, focusing on the tracks. Around midday, I stopped and ate a little, sitting on a fallen log. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. Across the stream, about 50 yards away, I saw movement. Not a deer, a man. He was standing between the trees, not walking, not hunting, just standing and watching. He wore dark clothing, nothing bright, and he didn't move when I looked in his direction. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, and when I looked again, he was gone. I told myself I must have imagined it. Maybe the fog and shadows played tricks on me. I tried to shake it off and got back to walking, but the feeling stayed, like eyes on me from somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. I didn't see any deer that day, and by the time the lights started fading, I turned back toward camp. On the way, I noticed broken branches along the trail I had taken earlier, ones that hadn't been there before. They weren't just random breaks, either. They looked like something heavy had moved through. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a moose or a bear, but the breaks were spaced almost evenly, like someone walking. Back at camp, I started the fire again. The warmth helped, but I couldn't relax. Every little noise in the woods felt closer, sharper. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow ones, moving just beyond the firelight. I sat still, rifle across my lap, listening hard. The sound stopped after a few minutes, and I stayed awake long into the night before finally giving in and sleeping. The next day, I didn't hunt as much. I mostly stayed near camp, uneasy about going deeper in. Around noon, I went to collect more firewood, and that's when I found something that froze me in place. About 30 yards from my tent, stuck into the ground, was a piece of wood. It was sharpened at one end, like a stake, and tied around it was a strip of cloth. The cloth looked worn, dirty, like it had been cut from someone's clothing. I hadn't seen it the day before. My stomach turned. Someone had been close to my camp, close enough to leave that behind. I grabbed it and threw it into the fire, watching the cloth burn away. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the thought of that man I thought I'd seen. If he was real, if he had followed me, then I wasn't out here alone anymore. That night was worse. The fire barely gave me comfort. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard movement. At one point, I swore I heard breathing outside the tent. Deep, steady breaths, just feet away. I didn't move. I clutched the rifle tight and waited. The sound faded eventually, but I didn't sleep at all after that. When the sun came up, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed up quickly, shoving gear into my pack, rolling up the tent with shaking hands. I wanted out of there. I started back toward the dirt road where my truck was parked, but the whole way, I felt like I was being shadowed. Every time I stopped, the woods went quiet. Then I'd hear a branch snap off in the distance. I never saw anyone, but I knew I wasn't alone. The final stretch to the truck was the longest walk of my life. My legs felt heavy, my throat dry, every sound behind me pressing me to move faster. When I finally saw the clearing, I almost ran. The truck was just where I left it, and I threw my gear into the bed without caring if it scattered. I climbed inside, started the engine, and drove off, not daring to look back at the treeline. On the drive home, I kept replaying everything in my head. The man in the trees, the broken branches, the stake in the ground, the breathing outside my tent. It all added up to one thing. Someone had been out there watching me, following me, maybe even waiting for the right chance. I'll never know who it was or what they wanted, but I knew I wasn't safe. I never went back to that area again. I still hunt sometimes, but never alone, and never that deep into the woods. I learned that being out there by yourself isn't just about nature and survival. It's about the fact that you don't know who else might be out there with you, hiding in the trees, waiting and watching. That trip changed the way I look at the woods. I went in thinking I was prepared, but nothing could have prepared me for that. I didn't see a single deer, didn't fire a single shot, but I came back with a story I'll never forget and a lesson burned into my head. The scariest thing in the forest isn't the animals, it's the people. I had been traveling alone through France in the summer of 2016. I was 27 at the time, and after weeks of moving from one town to another, I wanted to spend a few days in nature. I had picked up a cheap tent in Lyon and decided to camp out in a forested area near the edge of the Dordogne region. I had read online that there were places where you could camp freely if you stayed out of the way and didn't bother anyone. I wanted quiet, and I wanted to get away from the crowded hostels and noisy city streets. The spot I chose was about a 40-minute walk from a small village. I had parked my rental car just outside the village near a dirt trail and carried my gear on foot. The trail wound through fields and then dipped into thick forest. It was the kind of forest that looked peaceful in the day, with tall trees breaking up the sunlight, but I could already imagine how different it would feel once night came and the wind moved through the branches. I found a small clearing a little off the trail. The ground was flat, and it was hidden enough that nobody passing by would see me. Felt perfect. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and cooked a simple meal on my small gas stove. The first night was uneventful. I sat outside, listened to the sounds of the forest, and fell asleep earlier than I thought I would. I woke up once or twice in the night, but it was only because of animals moving around. I wasn't worried. The second day, I hiked further into the forest and followed a stream for a while. The sun was strong, and I remember sitting on a rock near the water, eating bread and cheese I had brought with me. I didn't see another person the whole day, which was exactly what I wanted. When I returned to my campsite, I was tired but content. I made another simple meal, read from a paperback book until it got too dark, and then zipped myself inside the tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet in that heavy way that makes every little sound stand out. Then I heard it again. A crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate, not far from where my tent was. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer maybe, or even a wild boar, but the sound didn't match. It wasn't the fast, darting movement of an animal. It was steady, step after step, and then it stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear more. After a minute of silence, I convinced myself I was imagining it. I rolled over and eventually forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. I left the tent, stretched, and walked a short way to collect water from the stream. When I got back, I noticed something odd. About 20 feet away from my tent, the grass was pressed down, as if someone had stood there for a while. It wasn't a huge area, just one small patch where the ground looked disturbed. I tried to brush it off as nothing, maybe an animal had laid there, but the shape looked more like footprints pressed close together. That day, I couldn't shake the unease. I spent less time hiking and stayed closer to camp. I checked my phone, but of course, there was no signal deep in the forest. I considered packing up, but part of me thought I was just overthinking it. When evening came, I cooked again and tried to distract myself with my book. By the time I crawled into the tent, my nerves were tight. I told myself I'd leave in the morning. Around 2 or 3 at night, I woke up again. This time I knew I hadn't imagined it. I heard the crunch of footsteps, slow and heavy, moving closer. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps stopped right outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I stared at the thin fabric of the tent, seeing the faint outline of a figure. Someone was standing there. They weren't moving, just standing. My mind was racing, trying to decide what to do. My phone was beside me, but I knew there was no service. My small pocket knife was in my backpack at the far end of the tent, too far to reach without making noise. I lay frozen for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, the figure moved. The sound of leaves crunching faded as they walked away into the trees. I stayed awake until daylight, too afraid to sleep. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent cautiously. The area outside looked undisturbed, except for a few prints in the soft dirt. Definitely shoe prints, not animal tracks. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out there watching me. I packed my things as quickly as I could and decided to head back to the village. But when I reached the trail, I hesitated. If the man was still around, what if he followed me? What if he was waiting further down? The forest felt too quiet, and every sound made me spin around. I walked fast, my backpack bouncing against me, sweat running down my back even though the air was cool. Halfway back to the car, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. On a tree just off the trail, carved into the bark, was a fresh mark. 3 deep lines, scratched down vertically. It didn't look natural. I had walked that trail before and hadn't seen it. Someone had been there recently, maybe even that night. I didn't stop to study it. I kept moving, forcing myself not to look behind me. My whole body was tense, waiting for the sound of footsteps following. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, and every bend made me think I'd see someone standing there. When I finally reached the edge of the village and saw my car, I almost laughed from relief. I threw my backpack into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I drove until I was miles away, until the forest was just a blur in my rearview mirror. That night, I checked into a small hotel in a nearby town. I sat on the bed for a long time, thinking about how close I had been to danger. Whoever that man was, he hadn't said a word, hadn't tried to break into the tent. But the way he had stood there in the dark, just watching, was worse than anything else I could imagine. I never went back to that forest. I finished my trip in France, but I stayed in towns and hostels after that. Even now, years later, I think about those nights sometimes. The memory of waking up and seeing that faint outline outside my tent has stayed sharp in my mind. I still wonder who he was and what he wanted. Maybe he was just passing through. Maybe he was curious. Or maybe he was waiting for me to fall asleep again. What makes it worse is that I'll never know. The forest was silent. The man never spoke. And all I have left are the footsteps in the night and those fresh footprints outside my tent. That was enough to change the way I look at camping forever. had been planning that trip for months. It was the summer of 2011, and I was 23 at the time. I had saved up for my job at a hardware store in Ohio and wanted to take a solo camping trip, something far from the usual campgrounds packed with families and loud radios. I picked a stretch of forest in West Virginia, a spot I had read about on a small hiking forum. The place wasn't an official campsite, just an area where people said you could set up a tent if you knew where to pull off the logging road. I wanted that quiet, that solitude, the kind where you hear nothing but your own breathing and the woods around you. I left home on a Friday morning, my old green Ford Ranger rattling the whole way down. I had my tent, sleeping bag, a cooler of food, a small propane stove, a headlamp, and my hunting knife strapped to my belt. I carried a .22 rifle in the truck too, mostly for peace of mind, though I didn't really expect to need it. By late afternoon, I found the turnoff road. It was a narrow dirt track, overgrown in spots, with ruts deep enough that I had to crawl in first gear. The forest swallowed me up quick, the branches brushing the sides of the truck. I drove until the road faded into little more than a trail. There I found a small clearing with enough space for my tent and a fire. It was perfect. The first night felt like exactly what I came for. I built a fire, cooked a can of chili, and leaned back in my folding chair with the rifle propped against the truck. The woods were alive with cicadas and the occasional snap of a branch far off. It was calm in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. The second day, I hiked along an old game trail I found behind the clearing. I followed it for hours, winding past ridges and a creek bed, taking pictures on a cheap digital camera I had at the time. I came across no one, not a single sign of other people. By evening, I was back at camp, sore and sweaty, and I made another fire to cook some noodles. It was that night when things began to feel different. As the fire burned down low, I sat listening to the woods. The normal sounds were there at first, the insects, a night bird calling, but then they stopped. I noticed it because the silence hit all at once, heavy and unnatural. My skin prickled. In that quiet, I heard something faint, like slow footsteps moving through the leaves. Not close, but not far either. The steps came, then paused, then came again. I turned my headlamp in that direction, but the beam cut into only the first few trees, the rest swallowed in darkness. I told myself it could be a deer or maybe even a raccoon, but the weight of those steps didn't sound small. I stoked the fire higher and kept the rifle leaning close. Eventually the noises faded, and I tried to sleep inside my tent, though I barely rested. I woke up at every crunch, every rustle outside. The next morning, I walked around the edge of the clearing, scanning for tracks. I found some impressions in the damp soil, but they were too distorted to tell if they were boots or just odd-shaped animal prints. That unease sat in my stomach, but I convinced myself I was overthinking. Still, I decided I'd pack up the following morning instead of staying the extra day I had planned. That afternoon, I fished in the creek a mile down, trying to settle my nerves. I caught nothing and headed back before dark. When I came into the clearing, I stopped dead. My cooler was moved. I had left it under the truck bed's shadow, but now it sat near the edge of the clearing, lid open. Inside, most of the food was still there, but a couple cans were missing. My heart thumped hard. Animals don't move coolers like that, not neatly anyway. Someone had been here. I circled the clearing with the rifle in hand, my eyes cutting through the trees. Nothing, not a sound. As darkness came, I built a smaller fire than before, trying to stay low profile. I ate quick and sat with my back to the truck, rifle across my lap. The woods felt like they were watching me. Every shadow looked like it held someone. Hours crawled. Then I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time they were closer. Slow, steady crunches circling the clearing. My chest tightened. I flicked the headlamp on and shined it toward the sound. The light swept tree trunks, brush, empty space. No one. The steps stopped when the light moved. I turned it off. After a minute, the steps started again, shifting positions, as if whoever it was moving around me in a wide circle. I called out nothing. I didn't dare. My throat was dry as sand. Instead, I cocked the rifle, the metallic click sounding too loud in the silence. The steps paused. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat inside the truck with the doors locked, rifle laid across the seat. I must have dozed off near dawn because the next thing I knew, weak sunlight was pushing through the windshield. The clearing looked empty, untouched, but I knew better now. I packed in a rush, shoving gear into the truck bed, not caring about order. As I folded the tent, I noticed boot prints in the dirt near where I'd heard the steps. Clear, sharp impressions. They weren't mine. They circled the clearing just beyond the fire's light. Whoever it was had stood out there all night, watching. Driving out, every bump in the road felt like it slowed me too much. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out into the trail. But the road stayed empty, just trees sliding past until I reached the highway. Only when I hit asphalt did I let myself breathe. I never went back to that part of West Virginia. I told myself I'd camp again somewhere else, maybe a public park with rangers nearby. But even years later, I still think about those footsteps. The cooler moved, the boots circling in the dark. Someone had been out there with me, someone who didn't want me to know they were there. Not at first. What scares me most isn't that I left. It's wondering what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I was 22 when I decided to spend a few days camping alone in northern Arizona. It was early October 2016, and I had been pushing myself too hard at work and needed a break from everything. I drove out past the small town of Holbrook, parked my old truck near a dirt road that led into the woods, and carried my gear deep enough so I wouldn't see or hear the road. I wanted to be cut off, no cell signal, no noise, nothing but me and the trees. The days were still warm, but the nights were cool enough that I packed extra blankets and a heavy jacket. The first night went smooth. I set up my small dome tent on a patch of dirt between two tall pines, gathered wood for a fire, and cooked a simple meal. I ate while watching the sun fade behind the horizon, the sky shifting from gold to dark purple. The silence was heavy but calming. I kept the fire going until close to midnight, then crawled into my sleeping bag and drifted off to the faint crackling of the embers outside. The second day, I hiked further into the forest, carrying only a small pack. The trails weren't marked, so I followed deer paths, snapping branches behind me as a breadcrumb trail back. I saw no one, heard no voices, no gunshots, no signs of other campers. It was perfect solitude. When I got back late that afternoon, I noticed something odd. My tent flap was unzipped about halfway. I knew I had zipped it fully when I left. Inside, nothing was missing, but the blankets were disturbed, as if someone had moved them around. I brushed it off as maybe I hadn't zipped it properly, though the thought stuck in the back of my head the rest of the night. That evening, I kept the fire bigger and closer to my tent. The light gave me some comfort. I ate my food and sat there longer than the night before, watching the tree line. Around midnight, when the fire was low and the night was dead quiet, I heard something, a branch snapping, not the little crackle of a squirrel or bird, but a heavy step, maybe 30 yards away. My chest tightened. I stayed still, holding my breath, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the trees. I told myself it was an elk or maybe a stray cow from a nearby ranch, but the sound was too careful, too steady. After a long minute of silence, I forced myself into the tent, zipped it, and lay there stiff, listening. Sleep was hard to come by, but I must have drifted off because I woke up hours later to the faint sound of something moving outside. Leaves crunching, slow and deliberate, circling the tent. I froze, not daring to move. The steps stopped just feet away. Then I heard it, a sound like breathing, ragged and uneven. It wasn't an animal's snort or huff. It was too human. My mouth went dry. I clenched the handle of the small hatchet I kept beside my sleeping bag and waited. After a while, the steps moved off and faded. I stayed awake until dawn, eyes wide open, heart racing every time a branch creaked. When daylight came, I stepped outside to check the ground. Sure enough, there were tracks around my tent. They looked human, bare feet pressed into the dirt, long narrow prints, toes visible. My skin prickled all over. Someone had walked barefoot around me in the night. I packed up some of my gear, debating if I should just leave, but stubbornness got the better of me. I had come out here for peace, and I wasn't ready to give it up yet. I convinced myself maybe it was some drifter wandering the woods, and as long as I was cautious, I'd be fine. That day, I didn't hike far. I stayed close to camp, gathering extra firewood, stacking it high. I kept scanning the trees, waiting to see movement. Nothing came. The woods felt emptier than before, the silence thicker. Even the birds seemed gone. As the sun sank that night, I built the fire bigger than ever, feeding it constantly. I stayed sitting up, hatchet on my lap, flashlight in hand. The hours dragged. Around 2 in the morning, the fire burned low, and that's when I heard it again. Steps, slow and heavy, pacing at the edge of the light. I shined my flashlight into the dark. For a split second, I caught sight of something. A figure standing between the trees, tall and thin, shoulders hunched. The skin looked pale, almost gray, stretched tight like it didn't belong. It stood there too still, staring straight at me, though I couldn't see its eyes. My whole body went cold. I gripped the hatchet, pulse pounding in my ears. I shouted out, my voice cracking, even though I told myself not to. The figure moved back into the shadows without a sound. I didn't sleep at all after that. I fed the fire until dawn, every flicker of movement in the darkness sending panic through me. By morning, I'd had enough. I started tearing down my camp, throwing gear into my pack as fast as I could. That's when I saw it again. Across the clearing, maybe 40 yards away, it stood at the tree line, watching me. Same tall, thin frame, that sickly pale skin, its arms hanging too long at its sides. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared. My stomach twisted. I grabbed my pack and hatchet, didn't even bother folding the tent. I just started walking fast, not running, not wanting to trigger it, but my legs felt like they would give out with every step. The walk back to my truck was the longest of my life. I kept hearing twigs snap behind me, faint but steady, like it was following just out of sight. Every time I glanced back, I'd catch the blur of pale skin slipping between trees. My chest ached from holding my breath so much. By the time I broke through the woods and saw the dirt road ahead, I was drenched in sweat, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped the hatchet. I threw my pack into the bed of the truck, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I looked in the rearview mirror. For a second, I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees, body hunched, head tilted like it was studying me. Then it stepped back and was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away, back on the highway surrounded by traffic. Even then, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see it sitting in the bed of the truck or running along the roadside. That was the last time I camped alone. I still don't know what I saw out there. I've read stories about things people call skinwalkers, but I don't pretend to understand it. All I know is it wasn't right. It wasn't just some stranger messing with me. There was something wrong with the way it moved, the way it watched me. When people ask why I don't camp anymore, I just tell them I had a bad trip once. I don't give details, but at night, when I think back to those tracks around my tent, or that pale figure standing too still in the trees, I know it wasn't just a bad trip. It was something I wasn't supposed to see, and I hope I never see it again. I was 27 years old in the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in northern Arizona. I had been working long weeks in construction, and my head felt clogged with the noise of the city and the constant pressure of schedules. I wanted open space, quiet air, and the feeling of being away from everyone. I bought a new sleeping bag and some gear from a sporting goods store, packed up my old Chevy Silverado, and drove north until the city lights faded out behind me. The plan was simple. I would spend 3 nights near the Mogollon Rim, far enough from the tourist areas to feel alone, but not so far that I'd be completely off the map. I had a cooler of food, plenty of water, a small propane stove, and my 9mm pistol locked in the glove box for peace of mind. I didn't tell many people about the trip, just my brother, who thought I was crazy for going alone. But I had always enjoyed the quiet, and being by myself never really bothered me. I pulled off a forest road late in the afternoon, found a flat clearing surrounded by tall pines, and set up camp. The ground smelled of sap and dry dirt, and the air was cooler than the city heat I'd left behind. After I set up my tent, I walked a bit down a slope and found a small stream trickling through rocks. It felt perfect, secluded, peaceful, the kind of place where you hear your own heartbeat when you sit still. The first night went fine. I cooked a can of chili on the little stove, sat by a fire I had built, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. The stars were wide and sharp, the kind of sky you only get far from city lights. I crawled into my tent around 10, zipped the flap, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets. It was the second night that things changed. During the day, I had hiked along the ridge, found some deer tracks, and even spotted a hawk circling overhead. I felt relaxed, lighter than I had in months. By the time I came back to camp, the sun was low, and I was sore in that good way you get from walking miles. I made ramen noodles over the stove and watched the sun fade behind the trees. It was quiet until the sky went dark. Too quiet, actually. I had grown used to the buzz of insects and the distant calls of birds, but that night the forest seemed to shut itself off. Around 9, I was poking at the fire when I heard what sounded like footsteps in the brush about 30 yards away. At first I thought it might be a deer, but the crunch was heavy, deliberate, too steady to be an animal moving randomly. I froze, staring into the black wall of trees. Nothing moved, but I could feel it. Something was there, just out of sight. My heart started to hammer. I reminded myself that I wasn't far from a dirt road, that hunters came through these woods sometimes. Maybe it was another camper, but the thought of someone standing out there, watching, made my skin crawl. I put out the fire early and crawled into my tent. I lay on my sleeping bag, every muscle tense, listening. For a while, there was only silence, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Then I heard it again, slow, steady crunching in the pine needles, closer this time, maybe 20 feet from the tent. I held my breath, hand on the pocket knife I kept beside me. The footsteps circled halfway around my tent, then stopped. I could hear faint breathing, or maybe it was just the wind moving, but my stomach twisted so hard I thought I might throw up. After what felt like forever, the sound faded like whoever or whatever it was had walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound had me sitting up, straining my ears. When the sky finally turned gray, I crawled out and scanned the clearing. Nothing looked disturbed, no tracks I could see, but I couldn't shake the feeling. My nerves were shot. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then, but pride kept me there. I told myself I was overreacting, that I had just spooked myself with shadows and noises. People camp alone all the time. Still, I carried my pistol in its holster on my hip that whole day, even when I walked down to the stream for water. By evening, The uneasy feeling came back strong. I made a small fire but sat with my back against the truck instead of near the flames. I wanted a view of the tree line, wanted to see anything that might step out. Around midnight, I had almost talked myself into sleeping in the cab of the truck instead of the tent. Then I heard it again, the crunch of pine needles, slow, dragging steps. This time there was no mistaking it. It was a person, too heavy to be an animal, too deliberate. My skin went cold. I clicked off the lantern and sat in the dark, gripping the pistol. My breath sounded too loud in my own ears. The steps came closer, maybe 15 feet away, stopping every few seconds like they were waiting for me to move. My chest tightened. I finally yelled out, hoping my voice would scare whoever it was. The steps stopped completely. Silence pressed down around me. I sat there, gun shaking in my hands, until my throat felt dry. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't even know. Eventually, the forest seemed to go still again. But I couldn't shake the thought. Who was out there, standing so close, and why hadn't they said anything? By the time dawn came, I made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my tent in a rush, shoving things into the truck bed, constantly looking over my shoulder. My hands shook so bad I dropped the stove twice. When I finally drove down the dirt road, my eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. The feeling of being watched didn't leave until I hit the highway and saw other cars. Back in the city, I told myself I'd been paranoid, that maybe it was another camper messing around, or even just a stray animal moving strangely. But deep down, I know it was a person. Someone was out there in the dark, circling my camp, staying silent on purpose. That's the part that still bothers me. If it had been another camper, they could have called out, said something. If it was a hunter, they would have kept their distance. Whoever it was didn't want me to know who they were, and they wanted me scared. I never went back to that forest again. Even now, years later, when I think about camping alone, I remember the sound of those slow footsteps circling my tent in the dark, and the silence after I called out. I tell myself I left at the right time. If I had stayed one more night, I don't know what would have happened.